My father, Friedrich Guderian, Oberleutnant of the 2nd Pomeranian Jager Battalion, was born August 3, 1858, in Großclone, Tuchel County. My mother, Clara, was born February 26, 1865, in Niemsik, Culm County. Both of my grandfathers were landowners. All other ancestors known to me were either landowners or lawyers and lived in the water area, East or West Prussia. My father was the first career officer in our lineage. On October 2, 1890, my brother Fritz was born. In 1891, a military career took my father to Colmar, where I entered school as soon as I was 6 years old. In December 1900, my father was transferred to Savold LD, and since there was no high school in this small town, my parents found themselves forced to send both sons to study in another town. The modest means of my parents, as well as my and my brother's desire to become officers, were the reasons why the Cadet Corps was chosen to continue our education. On April 1, 1901, my brother and I were admitted to the Junior Cadet Corps in Karlsruhe, and on April 1, 1903, I was transferred to the Senior Cadet Corps in Groß-Lichterfeld near Berlin. 2 years later, my brother was also enrolled here. In February 1907, I passed the matriculation examination. With a feeling of deep gratitude and respect, I remember my then bosses and tutors. The methods of education in the Cadet Corps were, of course, military, strict and uncomplicated, but they were based on kindness and justice. In teaching, they followed the program of the real school. In this respect, the Cadet Corps was not behind the corresponding civilian educational institutions. It gave us thorough knowledge necessary in life. In February 1907, I was sent to the 10th Hanoverian Jager Battalion in Bitch. The battalion commander until December 1908 was my father. This happy circumstance gave me the opportunity after 6 years of separation to live with my parents again. After graduating from the military school in Metz, where I studied from April to December 1907, I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant on January 27, 1908. Several years, until the outbreak of the First World War, I lived the happy life of a lieutenant. October 1, 1909, the Jager Battalion in which I served was transferred to its formation area with Goslar. There I was engaged to Margaretha Gerner, who became on October 1, 1913. My wife and faithful friend, who for many years walked with me along the winding and not always easy path of the soldier. Our happy life was interrupted by the war that broke out on August 2, 1914. For the next 4 years, I was only occasionally able to visit my family during short vacations. On August 23, 1914, my son Heinz Gunther was born to me, and on September 17, 1918, a second son, Kurt. At the beginning of the war, my beloved father died, who after a severe operation was forced to May 14, 1914. He was forced to retire from the army on May 14, 1914. Father was a model of a man and soldier to me. Mother outlived father by 16 years and died in March 1931. After the end of the war, starting in 1918, I served in the troops guarding the eastern borders, first in Silesia and then in the Baltics. Details of my military service are given in the biographical chronicle at the end of the book. Until 1922, I served mainly in the district headquarters and in the Reichswehr Ministry, specializing mainly in infantry. But my service in the 3rd Telegraph Battalion in Koblenz, as well as my service in various radiotelegraph units at the beginning of the First World War, gave me the opportunity to acquire some knowledge, which came in very handy later on in the creation of a new branch of the army. In the period between the two wars, I was mainly concerned with the organization of the German armored forces. Although I was an infantryman by military training and did not have any technical education, fate linked me for a long time with activities related to the motorization of troops. After returning from the Baltic states in the fall of 1919 and a short service in the 10th Brigade of the Reichswehr in Hanover, I was appointed in January 1920. Company commander of the Jager Battalion in Goslar, in which I served until I did not even think of returning to the General Staff, to whose corps of officers I belonged until the fall of 1920, because my departure from the Baltic was connected with difficulties of a service nature. I had almost no prospects of making a military career in the reduced staff of the 100,000 Reichswehr. I was astonished when in the fall of 1921, my regimental commander, Colonel von Arnsberg, asked me if I would like to return to the General Staff. I gave my consent, but for some time nothing was reported to me. And it was not until January 1922 that I was summoned to me by Oberleutnant Joachim von Stolpnagel, who worked in the Department of Troops of the Ministry of the Reichswehr, and asked why I had not yet gone to Munich. From him I learned that the command intends to transfer me to the Inspectorate of Military Communications in the Department of Automobile Troops, because the inspector, General von Chiswitz, needs an officer of the General Staff. He added that I would be transferred to the Ministry of the Reichswehr on April 1, and that I would be given the opportunity to become practically acquainted with the work of the automobile troops by that date, for which purpose I would be sent to Munich to the 7th Bavarian Automobile Battalion, where I was to go immediately. Excited about the new assignment, I immediately left for Munich and went to see the battalion commander, Major Lutz, with whom I'd worked together for several years. We were linked not only by our joint work. I treated him with sincere respect, and he treated me with exceptional favour. In Munich, I was assigned to the 1st Company, commanded by a professional pilot Wimmer. Major Lutz informed me that in the ministry I would be entrusted with the task of working out the question of the organisation and use of automobile troops. In Munich, I was to be mainly concerned with preparations for the fulfilment of the said task. Major Lutz and Captain Wimmer did everything to enable me to study in detail the organisation of work in the battalion. On April 1, 1922, I reported to General von Chiswitz in Berlin for instructions concerning my new service in the Reichswehr Ministry. He informed me that he had originally intended to use me to develop the use of motorized troops. However, his Chief of Staff, Major Petter, had decided to assign me to study a number of other matters relating to machine shops, gasoline depots, special facilities, technical staffing, and automobile transportation. I was quite surprised at this and informed the General that I was completely unprepared for the development of these mainly technical problems, and that I did not have the necessary knowledge to lead in this field. General von Chiswitz replied that at first he had intended to use me exactly as he had conveyed through Major Lutz, but the Chief of Staff proved to him that according to the Prussian War Ministry regulations of 1873, the Chief of Staff, not the inspector, was in charge of personnel allocation. Therefore he, the General, unfortunately could not change anything, but would try to involve me also in the development of the issues he had planned. My request that I be seconded to the Jaeger Company was denied, so I was transferred to work in the field of technology, which I had to put up with. My predecessor had left behind nothing of value, except a few unfinished documents. I found friendly support only in the person of some old officials of the Ministry of War, who were familiar with business papers and knew the techniques of office work. My new work was very instructive and useful for my further improvement, but the most valuable was the study of the problem of troop movements by automobile assigned to me by General von Chiswitz. Through this work, which was preceded by a little practical training in the Haas, I became acquainted for the first time with the possibilities of using motorized troops. I could now have my own judgment on the subject. General von Chiswitz was extremely critical of my performance. Paying special attention to accuracy, he did not miss any of my mistakes, which helped me to acquire the necessary knowledge. In World War I, troop movements by motor vehicles were often used, but they were always carried out in positional defense, and there was not a single case that in maneuver warfare they were conducted directly toward the enemy. For unreinforced Germany, it seemed incredible that the future war would begin precisely as a positional war, with a stable front line, so we were forced to reckon with the need to conduct a mobile defense. The problem of transferring motorized troops in the conditions of maneuver warfare immediately caused the need to organize the protection of these transfers. Effective guarding could be carried out only by armored vehicles, and so I began to study history, trying to get acquainted with the experience of using armored vehicles. Thus, I got acquainted with a young Oberleutnant Volkheim, who processed the little data available on the use of small armoured units by the Germans during the First World War, as well as data on the use of larger armoured forces by the enemy. This data was of some value to our small army. Volkheim provided me with some literature, and I was able to begin to study the still poorly developed theory of the use of armoured forces. The most extensive experience in this area had the British and the French. I got the necessary literature and began to study it. These were mainly English articles and books by Fuller, Liddell Garth and Martel, which I was extremely interested in and enriched my imagination. These visionaries already in that period wanted to turn armoured forces into something more significant than an auxiliary branch of troops for the infantry. They placed the tank at the center of the budding motorization of our era, and were thus major innovators in the development of modern methods of warfare. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Since no one but me was dealing with this problem, I soon became an expert. This was facilitated by small articles that I published from time to time in the newspaper Militärischen Blatt, whose editor, General von Altrock, repeatedly visited me, encouraging me to cooperate in the newspaper. He was a true soldier and willingly made the pages of the newspaper available for articles on the most pressing military issues of the day. Cooperation in the newspaper gave me the opportunity to get acquainted with the Austrian Fritz Heigl, author of the Tanker's Handbook, who benefited from some of my advice on tactical matters. In the winter of 1923-24, I led a war game on the theme use of motorized troops in interaction with aviation. I was entrusted with the leadership of the game by Lieutenant Colonel von Brauchitsch, the future Commander-in-Chief of the German Land. The game was approved by the Combat Training Department. I was offered to become a teacher of tactics and military history. After the appropriate examination, I was sent on a so-called training trip. In the fall of 1924, I arrived at the headquarters of the 2nd Division in Stettin, which at that time was commanded by General von Chieswitz, who again became my superior. Before moving to Stettin, under the direction of Colonel von Natzmer, who replaced Chieswitz as inspector of motorized troops, I conducted a series of tactical exercises on the use of armored troops in conjunction with cavalry for reconnaissance. During the exercises, we used only the clumsy armored vehicles we were allowed to have under the Treaty of Versailles, although these vehicles, because of their great weight, were able to move mainly only on roads. I was satisfied with the results of the training and, when summarizing the results, expressed the hope that the automobile troops would now be removed from the rear guard and become combat units. However, my inspector was of the opposite opinion, and in response to my remarks, he retorted, "To hell with combat units. Let them transport flour." So I arrived in Stettin to teach tactics and military history to officers destined for the general staff. The new service required a lot of work. Before my very critical students, I had to set well-thought-out tasks, comprehensively evaluate the solution of these tasks, and draw clear conclusions. In teaching military history, I paid considerable attention to Napoleon's campaign of 1806. The study of this campaign in Germany had previously been neglected because it ended in a sensitive defeat. However, from the point of view of maneuver operations, it is quite instructive. I next turned my attention to the history of German and French cavalry fighting in the fall of 1914. A detailed study of this subject proved extremely useful in the further development of my tactical and operational views, for it further strengthened me, in my opinion, to maximize the use of the element of mobility in warfare. In the course of tactical training and war games, I endeavored at every opportunity to present my views to the students. My immediate superior, Major Hearing, took notice of this and noted it in my performance review. After 3 years of teaching, I was again sent to the Ministry of the Reichswehr, where I began to work in the Military Transportation Department of the Troop Directorate, the head of which was Colonel Harm, and later Lieutenant Colonels Wieger and Kuhne. The Military Transportation Department was at that time subordinate to the Operations Department. I was assigned to write an abstract in which I was to present my views on the possibilities of moving troops by road. It seemed to the Troops Department at that time possible to make large transfers of units and formations of normal composition on ordinary trucks. We had no other means of transportation at that time. While studying this question, we encountered a number of difficulties arising from the properties of this type of transportation. The French, during the First World War, had made similar troop movements, in particular during the Battle of Verdun. However, they were carried out behind a fixed front line, and in such conditions there was no need for immediate delivery to the destination point of all the mounted transport belonging to the division, and especially artillery. When the question arose as to the possibility of moving entire divisions by motor transport together with all their rear areas in the conditions of maneuver warfare, it became obvious that this would require a huge number of trucks. We had a heated debate on this issue, and there were more doubters than believers. In the fall of 1928, Colonel Stottmeister of the Automotive Troops Training Department asked me to take over the teaching of tank tactics to his students. My superiors in the Troop Directorate agreed to my taking on this additional work. Thus, I started to study tanks again, though only theoretically so far. However, I lacked practical knowledge in this field. By that time, I had never been inside a tank. Now I had to teach a discipline directly related to tanks. Thorough preparation for the class required me to seriously study various sources. Theoretical development of the issue now no longer presented such difficulties as in the first time of my work in the Ministry of the Reichswehr, because by this time there was already a rich literature on the past war, and in foreign armies were even published the relevant manuals. For practical training, tank models were used. Initially the models were covered with sailcloth and moved by people, and later they were made of tin and moved with the help of a motor. We conducted such exercises together with the infantry, in particular with the units of the 3rd Battalion of the 9th Infantry Regiment, which was successively commanded by Lieutenant Colonels Bush and Lees. During these exercises I met my future colleague Wenck, then adjutant of the 3rd Battalion. We practiced with him systematically, studying the actions in combat of single tanks, tank platoons, companies and battalions. Although the opportunities for practical training were rather limited, nevertheless we gradually gained a fairly clear idea of the prospects for the use of tanks in modern warfare. Particularly fruitful for the work of my imagination was my 4-week business trip to Sweden, during which I had the opportunity to practically familiarize myself with the last model of the German LQI tank used during the war. On our way to Sweden, my wife and I visited Denmark, where we spent a pleasant few days in and around Copenhagen. We were deeply impressed by Thorvaldsen's beautiful sculptures. Sitting on the terrace of Helsingør Castle, we recalled the words of Hamlet. There are many things in the world, friend Horatio, that your wise men never dreamed of. The rays of the sun painted the bronze barrels of the cannons a greenish colour. It was a magnificent picture. The further journey from Motala to Stockholm we made by steamer. On the way we stopped to see the beautiful old church of Rita. The next day we saw the magnificent buildings of Stockholm, this Venice of the north. I was assigned to the 2nd Guards Battalion. Its commander, Colonel Buren, received me very kindly. I was attached to a company commanded by Captain Klingspor. With him I formed a lasting friendship, which lasted until his untimely death. The Swedish officers with whom we had to deal met us German officers very hospitably. During tactical training we were very warmly received by the local population, who provided us with apartments. We visited Captain Klingspor's mother-in-law, Madame Jederland, in her lovely castle by the sea. Madame Jederland owned a factory that produced an excellent Swedish punch, which we tasted to our heart's content. We visited the royal estate of Tulgan, which was run by a reserve officer named Bager, who had previously served in a tank battalion. Together with Colonel Buren, we went hunting. In Skansen, visited the open-air theatre, viewed the paintings of the famous artist Liljefors. In Drottningholm, we were shown the leather wallpaper from Wallenstein Palace in Prague, saved by the great Swedish King Gustav Adolf during the 30 Years' War. At the time we laughed at this strange term when the Castellan explained the meaning of this beautiful wallpaper. Now we can say that indeed some of these treasures were saved, for otherwise they would hardly have escaped destruction during the Second World War. Among them is the Codex Argenteus, placed under glass behind a purple silk curtain in the University Library of Uppsala. In the vicinity of this priceless document I found a Bible which King Henry I presented to the Cathedral of Goslar. It also belongs among the salvaged treasures from more than 250 German cities, robbed by Gustavus Adolphus. To this day I still remember with great pleasure the trip to Sweden, which proved to be of great benefit to me. Also in 1929, I came to the conclusion that tanks alone or tanks attached to infantry could not be decisive. The study of military history. The results of manoeuvres in England and my own experience convinced me that the tanks can be used most effectively only when all other branches of the troops supporting the tanks will be given the same speed and possibility. Tanks must play the leading role in formations composed of the various branches of the army. All other branches of the army are obliged to act in favour of tanks. Therefore, it is necessary not to assign tanks to infantry divisions, but to create tank divisions, which should include various branches of troops to ensure the effectiveness of tanks. During the commander's training on the ground, conducted in the summer of 1929, leading one of the groups, I took a tank division as a basis. The training was successful, and I was sure that I was on the right track. However, the new inspector of military communications, General Otto von Stulpnagel, forbade me to operate tank formations during the classes, since he believed that the tank division was a utopia. I could only talk about tank regiments. In the fall of 1929, Colonel Lutz, Chief of Staff of the Motor Troops Inspection, a former patron of mine in Munich, asked me if I would like to become the commander of an automobile battalion. I gave my consent, and from February 1, 1930, I was appointed commander of the 3rd Prussian Automobile Battalion, stationed at Berlin-Lankwitz. The Furion consisted of 4 companies were located with the battalion headquarters in Berlin-Lankwitz. The 2nd Company in the training camp Doberitz-Elsgrund, and the 3rd Company in Niesede. The 4th Company was allocated from the 3rd Supply Battalion. After I had received the units of my battalion, Colonel Lutz assisted me in reforming the latter. The 1st Company was provided with armoured cars and the 4th with motorcycles. The 2 companies could thus form the nucleus of a future motorized reconnaissance battalion. The 2nd Company was designated as a tank company and provided with model tanks. The 3rd Company was intended to be an anti-tank company and was therefore provided with wooden model guns. Although the 1st Company had old armoured vehicles allowed to us by the Treaty of Versailles, but during the classes we used mock-ups in order to save motor resources. Only the motorcycle company had real armament, machine guns. So with great eagerness I started practical training with my improvised units, rejoicing that at last I became to a certain extent a full master of the unit. The officers and enlisted men practiced with great enthusiasm, for these exercises brought some freshness to the musty atmosphere of our army. But on the part of my superiors I did not meet with proper understanding. For example, the Inspector of Military Communications had so little faith in this still very young branch of the army that he forbade us to hold classes in the training camp together with other battalions. In the manoeuvres of the 3rd Division, which included our battalion, we were allowed to participate in only 1 platoon. The exception was our division commander, Joachim von Stolpnagel, who at one time informed me of my assignment to Munich. This exemplary general took great interest in our classes and was sensitive to our unit's requests, providing considerable assistance. Unfortunately, the general decided to retire in the spring of 1931 because of some trouble with the Reichswehr ministry. That same fall, our Inspector General Otto von Stolpnagel also retired. When I said goodbye to him, he said to Assertive, "But believe me that neither I nor you will live to see the time when the Germans will have their own tank forces." Skepticism paralyzed the strength of this intelligent man. He understood the significance of the problem, but did not know how to solve it. General Lutz, who had previously served as his chief of staff, was appointed inspector in his place. He was an intelligent man with extensive technical knowledge and great organizational skills. Recognizing the advantages of the tactical principles I had developed, he took my side completely. General Lutz appointed me as his chief of staff in the fall of 1931. From that time began a period of persistent struggle for the creation of tank forces, ending in the end with our victory. It was clear to us that the future structure of armoured forces should facilitate their use for operational tasks. Therefore, the organizational unit could only be a tank division, and in the future, a tank corps. The task was now to convince representatives of other branches of the army, as well as the army leadership, that our way was the right one. To do this was difficult, because no one believed that the automotive troops, which belong to the rear service, can be used for tactical and even operational purposes. The old branches of the military, primarily infantry and cavalry, were considered the main branch. The infantry was still called the Queen of the Fields. Since Germany was forbidden to have armoured troops, no one could see with their own eyes the much-vaunted new combat vehicle, and our tin tank models caused during manoeuvres mocking remarks of the participants of the First World War. Sometimes we were simply pitied, not taking our lessons seriously. At best, it was admitted that armoured forces could become an auxiliary branch of troops for the infantry, but no one considered them a new independent branch of troops. A particularly stubborn struggle broke out with our inspection of the cavalry. My general asked the cavalrymen what role they assign in the future cavalry. Will it perform reconnaissance or combat tasks? Inspector of Cavalry. General von Hirschberg replied that, in his opinion, the cavalry will perform tasks of a combat nature, and from the tasks of operational reconnaissance he refuses in favor of automotive troops. Therefore, we decided to prepare our armoured reconnaissance battalions to perform these tasks. At the same time, we sought to ensure that tank divisions were also created. Finally, we considered it necessary that a motorized anti-tank division be established in each infantry division, since we were convinced that for effective defense against tanks, it was necessary to have weapons whose speed of movement was equal to that of the tanks. General Nuckenhauer, formerly an infantryman who had succeeded General von Hirschberg, was not about to cede to us positions that the cavalry had already abandoned. The available at that time 3 cavalry divisions, he created a cavalry corps, intending to again entrust the cavalry tasks of operational intelligence, using our brainchild tank units. According to his thought, the arrival of cavalry officers in our new units should have a favourable effect on them. However, between us and the cavalry officers there were heated discussions, often taking too sharp forms. In the end, the new ideas triumphs. The motor triumphed over the horse and the gun over the pike. Along with questions of organisation and use of armoured forces, much attention was paid to the preparation of the material with which we wanted to implement our ideas. Some preliminary work had already been done in this field. Since 1926, an experimental station had been operating abroad, where German tanks had been tested. The Army Armament Department made an order to various firms to produce 2 types of medium tanks and 3 types of light tanks. 2 tanks of each type were produced. Thus, we received a total of 10 tanks. The medium tanks were armed with 75 mm guns and the light tanks with 37 mm guns. Experimental tanks had armour not made of steel but of cast iron. The speed of all these vehicles did not exceed 20 kilometers per hour. Captain Pioner, who was then in charge of tank design, strove to incorporate into the tank design a number of modern requirements, such as gas tightness, cross-country ability, all-round turret gun and machine gun fire, sufficiently high ground clearance, manoeuvrability. He succeeded to a large extent in doing so. This he largely succeeded in realizing. The seat for the tank commander, which was located at the front of the vehicle, next to the driver's seat, was not well equipped. The tank commander was deprived of any possibility to observe in the direction opposite to the tank's movement and had extremely limited possibilities to observe sideways from the direction of movement, as this was hindered by the tracks and too deep position of the seat. Tanks at that time were not yet equipped with radios. Although the tanks produced in the 20s were technically more advanced than those of the First World War, they were far from meeting the tactical requirements of the new developments. The prototype tanks could not be put into serial production, and new types of tanks had to be designed. At that time, we believed that tank divisions should be armed with 2 types of tanks. A light tank armed with an armour-piercing gun and turret and course machine guns, and a medium tank armed with a larger caliber gun and the same machine guns. In each tank battalion was supposed to arm 3 companies with light tanks and 1 company with medium tanks. The latter was intended to support companies of light tanks. At that time, we believed that to arm tank divisions should have 2 types of tanks. A light tank, armed with armour-piercing gun as well as turret and course machine guns, and medium tank, armed with a larger caliber gun and the same machine guns. In each tank battalion was supposed to arm 3 companies with light tanks and 1 company with medium tanks. The latter was intended to support companies of light tanks. On the question of the caliber of guns, our opinion differed with the opinion of the head of the armament department and the inspector of artillery, who believed that a light tank is quite enough to have a gun caliber of 37 MA, while I believed, anticipating the strengthening of armour tanks of foreign armies, that a light tank should have a gun caliber of 50 mm. However, in view of the fact that the infantry was then armed with a 37 mm anti-tank gun, I and General Lutz were forced to agree to arm light tanks with a 37 mm gun in order to simplify production. We, however, managed to agree on the manufacture of a light tank turret of such a diameter that it would allow further installation of a 50 ME cannon on it. It was decided to arm medium tanks with a 75 M caliber gun. The total weight of the tank was not to exceed 24 tons. The starting point for establishing this data was the load capacity of bridges on German roads. The speed of the tanks was set at 42 km. The crew of both light and medium tanks had to consist of 5 persons: tank commander, gunner, loader, driver and radio operator. The gunner and loader were to be in a rotating turret, while the tank commander was to have a separate, small commander's turret above the gunner's seat to allow for all-round observation. The driver and radio operator's seats were in front. The crew was to be commanded by Larynglophone. Communication between tanks was to be by radio. When these tank design requirements were compared with those of the previously mentioned prototypes, it was clear that they were based on new guidelines for the tactical and operational use of tanks. It was also clear that it would be several years before tanks of the new design would be suitable for combat operations. Therefore, we considered it necessary to create in the meantime such tanks that could be used for training purposes. We opted for a training tank mounted on a cartenoid chassis, purchased in England and designed to mount a 20M anti-aircraft gun. This type of training tank allowed only the installation of machine guns in a rotating turret. Such tanks, designated TI, could be produced by 1934 and used as training vehicles until the battle tanks were ready. Nobody, of course, thought in 1932 that with these small training tanks we would one day have to fight with the enemy. In view of the fact that the production of the main types of tanks was delayed for more time than we had anticipated, General Lutz decided to build another intermediate type of tank, armed with a 20M automatic cannon and one machine gun. The production of these tanks, designated TII, was carried out by the Mann Company. In the summer of 1932, in the training camps Grafenwiesche and Jüterbog, for the first time under the leadership of General Lutz, were held exercises of reinforced infantry regiments with the participation of tank battalions, having, of course, only models of tank. At manoeuvres held in the same year, for the first time since the Treaty of Versailles, participated German armoured vehicles, which were a temporary type on the chassis of a three-axle truck, lined with steel armour. Schoolchildren who had previously poked our models with their pencils to get a peek inside were as amazed by the new armoured vehicles as were the infantrymen who had previously been accustomed to defending themselves with stones against the tanks they despised. Bayonets were also useless against armour. These manoeuvres proved the possibility of combat use of motorized and tank units. The cavalry command in many cases still allowed attacks on us, considering our views unrealistic, but our successes were already so great that they could not be ignored. In the ranks of the most far-sighted young cavalry officers, there was a change in the direction of recognizing the prospects of a new branch of the army. Many of them realized that in our time the tried and tested principles of cavalry operations should be implemented by new means. At the manoeuvres of 1932, the aged Field Marshal Hindenburg was present for the last time. I was struck by the clarity with which he pointed out the mistakes made at the manoeuvres when summarizing the results. Speaking about the command of the cavalry corps, Hindenburg said, "In war, the key to success is the simplicity of the plan. I was in the headquarters of the cavalry corps. What I saw there was far from that." He was quite right. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor. From that time on, German domestic and foreign policy changed completely. I first saw and heard Hitler in early February at the opening of an automobile exhibition in Berlin. What was unusual was the fact that the Reich Chancellor himself opened the exhibition with an opening speech. His speech was also quite different from the speeches of ministers or chancellors who had spoken under similar circumstances. Hitler announced in his speech the abolition of the automobile tax and plans to build freeways and produce cheap automobiles. As for the field in which I was working, there had been a major change brought about by the appointment of General Blomberg as Minister of War and General Reichenau as Chief of the Ministry Chancellery. Both of them held modern views. In these two representatives of the High Command, I thus found men who fully understood the importance of armoured forces. It should be added that Hitler himself also showed great interest in the questions of motorization of the army and the creation of armoured forces. This was evidenced by the invitation I received through the Army Armament Department to demonstrate for half an hour in front of the Reich Chancellor in Kummersdorf units of motorized mechanized troop. I showed Hitler a motorcycle platoon, an anti-tank platoon, a platoon of TI training tanks, a platoon of light armoured vehicles and a platoon of heavy armoured vehicles. Hitler was greatly impressed by the speed and precision shown by our units during their movement, and he exclaimed, "This is what I need." After this incident, I had the impression that the Chancellor would fully agree with my plans for the organization of the new Wehrmacht, if I had succeeded in presenting my views to him. In this, however, I encountered considerable difficulties due to the sluggishness of our military organs and the negative attitude to my views on the part of the leading members of the General Staff, who prevented me from contacting General Blomberg. By the way, it is worth mentioning the fact characteristic of German politics that since 1890 only one Chancellor, namely Bismarck, once showed interest in the development of armament of the army, visiting Kummersdorf. Since then, no Chancellor had been here before Hitler. This was evidenced by the visitor's book, which the Chief of Armament, General Becker, opened in front of Hitler, asking him to sign. This fact proves that German policy was devoid of any militarism. On March 21, 1933, I attended the opening of the Reichstag, which took place in the garrison church of Potsdam. I took a seat upstairs, behind the Empress's empty chair, and behind the chair occupied by the aged Field Marshal Mackensen, from where I could admire the ancient paintings hung on the walls in front of the monument to Frederick the Great. On March 23, 1933, the notorious law granting extraordinary powers to the government was passed, giving the Reich Chancellor dictatorial powers. It was approved by a majority of votes cast by deputies from the National Front Party and the Centre Party. The Social Democratic Party courageously voted against this law, the ruinousness of which for the future fate of Germany many politicians did not realize at the time. Responsibility for its consequences must be borne by those politicians who voted in favor of its passage at the time. In the summer of 1933, the commander of the National Socialist Motorized Corps, Adolf Henlin, invited me to take part in a meeting of the Sea Storm Troopers, which was to be held in Godesberg and where Hitler promised to be present. I was interested in seeing Hitler among his close followers. Besides, Henlin himself was a straightforward and honest man to work with, so I promised him to come to the convention. Hitler gave a report on the National Socialist Revolution, displaying a fair knowledge of history. In his report, he pointed out that every revolution, after achieving its goal, passes into evolution. Such a period had already arrived for the National Socialist Revolution. He demanded of his followers that they take this fact into account. One could only hope that this demand of Hitler would be fulfilled. At this meeting, I had the opportunity to get acquainted with the chief judge of the party, Busch, who turned out to be a serious and balanced man, who held a reasonable view of things, but who unfortunately had no further opportunity to realize his principles. I left Godesberg in the hope that the period of evolution announced by Hitler would soon really come to pass. In 1933, the matter of organizing the armored forces had advanced considerably. A number of trial exercises and tactical exercises conducted with tank models gave me a clear idea of the interaction of tanks with other branches of the army, and once again strengthened my conviction that armored troops can play their part in modern warfare only when they are regarded as the basic branch of the army, are combined into tank divisions and reinforced by other fully motorized branches of the army. If in the field of tactical use of armored forces we have made some progress, the question of material still gave us a lot of trouble. As a result of the disarmament of Germany, carried out in accordance with the Treaty of Versailles, our industry did not produce war materials for a decade. The loss of qualified personnel and the lack of necessary equipment were the reasons why our wishes in the field of tank construction could not be quickly realized. Particularly great difficulties arose in the production of special steel for tanks, which had to have the necessary toughness. The first samples of steel plates for tanks broke like glass. It also took a long time to establish the production of radio equipment and optics for tanks. However, I did not repent that at that time I firmly insisted on the fulfillment of my requirements. Tanks should provide good observation and be easy to control. As far as tank control is concerned, we were always superior to our opponents in this respect. We were able to correct a number of not very significant shortcomings in the future. In the fall of 1933, General Baron von Fritsch was appointed commander of the ground forces. At the head of the army was thus a man who enjoyed the confidence of the entire officer corps. He was a noble, intelligent and chivalrously honest soldier who had the right tactical and operational view. While not possessing much technical knowledge, he was, however, always ready, without any prejudice, to take up the consideration of new proposals and to agree to them if only he could be convinced of their expediency. Therefore, to resolve with him issues relating to the development of armoured forces was much easier than with other representatives of the OKK. While still being the head of the operational department of the General Staff, he was interested in the issues of motorization and the creation of armoured forces. One of his trips to the troops he specifically devoted to the study of the organization of the tank division. Having received a new high appointment, Fritsch continued to show great interest in our cause. The following assessment is characteristic. I brought him for a report material on some technical issues. He expressed doubts about the correctness of some of the provisions and sighed, "You must know that all technicians lie." I replied, "Of course they often lie, but this usually becomes known to others a year or two after they are convinced that the ideas of these technicians cannot be put into practice. Tacticians also lie, but this becomes apparent only after a defeat received in the next war, i.e. too late. Fritsch moved his monocle thoughtfully from one eye to the other out of habit, and said, "Perhaps you are right." How reserved and almost shy he was in the presence of a large company of people. He was so frank and accessible among friends who he trusted. On such occasions his humour usually showed itself, and he was charmingly kind. It was much harder to work with the new Chief of General Staff, General Beck. This was a noble man of the old school with a balanced, even too balanced character, a follower of Moltke, whose views he wanted to be guided in the creation of the General Staff of the Third Empire. About modern sophisticated technology, he had no idea, due to the fact that the work in the General Staff, especially as his closest assistants, he selected people who held the same views with him. The central apparatus of the army over time gradually turned itself into a reactionary clique, with which it was extremely difficult to work. Beck opposed our plans for the organization of armored forces, believing that the tank troops should be an auxiliary branch of troops, contributing to the actions of infantry, and held the view that the largest unit of tank troops should be a tank brigade. He believed that the idea of creating tank divisions is unrealistic. With Beck, I mainly and had to fight on the formation of tank divisions and the creation of statutes for combat training of armoured forces. In the end, he agreed to the creation of 2 armoured divisions, while I insisted on the creation of 3. I tried with great fervour to prove to him the advantages of the new formations, especially their operational role. He kept telling me one thing: "No, no, I do not want to hear, you are too assertive." He did not believe my reports, in which I argued that the development of radio technology will provide control of tank formations despite the high speed of tanks. Beck was particularly unhappy with the statutory requirements that commanders of all grades must stay ahead of their troops. "How will they manage the battle," he said, "without having a desk with maps or a telephone? Have you not read Schlieffen? That a division commander could move forward enough to be where his troops came in contact with the enemy was beyond his comprehension." Beck, generally speaking, was a slow man, both militarily and politically. Everywhere he appeared he always exerted some paralyzing influence. In every new endeavour he saw difficulties and was full of apprehension. In order to have a fuller picture of him, it should be added that it was he who advocated fighting by the method of mobile defence, which was referred to in our manuals even before the First World War under the term deterrent fighting. Beck introduced the study by the whole army of mobile defence as a type of combat. The concept of this type of combat was characterized by complete obscurity, and I have never once seen the participants in classes on the subject satisfied with them. After tank divisions were established, Fritsch discontinued the study of mobile defence. In the spring of 1934, the Motorized Mechanized Troops Command was established. General Lutz was appointed their commander, and I was appointed his chief of staff. In addition, General Lutz continued to hold the position of Inspector of Motorized Troops and head of the Armament Division of the General Affairs Department of the War Ministry. Around this time, Hitler first met with Mussolini in Venice and remained as if dissatisfied with the results of this meeting. After his return, Hitler made a speech to the Wehrmacht generals and the leaders of the party and the stormtroopers. On the leaders of the stormtroopers, Hitler's speech did not make a strong impression. When leaving the hall were heard remarks of the following kind: "Adolf still has much to learn." From this I could conclude that there were considerable divisions within the party itself. On June 30, 1934, the riddle was solved. The chief of staff of the assault squads, Rehm, and many of the commanders of the assault squads were shot. Along with them were shot many innocent men and women, and, as it is now known, only because they had once opposed the party. Among those shot were former War Minister and Reich Chancellor General von Schleicher and his wife, as well as one of his staff, General von Bredow. An attempt to rehabilitate these 2 generals before public opinion came to nothing. Only the aged Field Marshal von Mackensen declared at a Schlieffen memorial evening held in 1935, attended by young and old officers of the General Staff, that the honour of Schleicher and Bredow had not been tarnished. Hitler's explanation of the matter in the Reichstag could not be considered satisfactory. At that time it was still hoped that the party would soon be cured of its childhood diseases. Looking back on the past, it is only to be regretted that the Wehrmacht leadership of that time did not show sufficient persistence to achieve complete satisfaction. In doing so, it would have done a great service to itself, to the Wehrmacht, and to the German people as a whole. On August 2, 1934, Germany suffered a heavy loss. Field Marshal von Hindenburg died, leaving his people in a state of internal revolutionary agitation, the further development of which could not be foreseen. On that day I wrote to my wife, "Our old ruler is no more. We are all greatly saddened by this irreparable loss. He was a father to our entire nation and especially to the Wehrmacht, and this heavy loss we will be able to compensate only with great difficulty and very shortly." The mere fact of Hindenburg's existence carried more weight in the eyes of foreign nations than written treaties and beautiful words. He enjoyed the confidence of the whole world. We who loved and respected him lost a lot. Tomorrow we will swear an oath to Hitler. An oath fraught with consequences. God willing, both sides will honour this oath equally for the good of Germany. As for the army, it is trained to honour the oath. Let it honourably observe it. You are right. It would be much better if the representatives of the various organizations would postpone all kinds of celebrations on this occasion and instead of making loud speeches, get down to the humble work of doing their duty. These lines, which I wrote on August 2, characterize not only my personal mood, but also the prevailing mood of many of my friends, as well as of the broader circles of our people at that time. On August 7, 1934, German soldiers carried their field marshal and Reich president to the Tannenberg cemetery for eternal rest. Hitler's last words to Hindenburg were, "Dead commander, from now on your place is in Valhalla." As early as August 1, the Reichschancellor and the cabinet, on the basis of the law granting extraordinary powers to the government, decided that in the event of Hindenburg's death, the Reichschancellor would be the Reich president. Thus, on August 2, Adolf Hitler became both head of state and supreme commander of the Wehrmacht. Since he retained the position of Reich Chancellor, in his hands was concentrated all the supreme power of the state. Hitler's dictatorship became henceforth almost unlimited. The year 1935 came, significant for the fact that in March of this year Germany received military sovereignty. Every soldier joyfully welcomed this event, which meant the abrogation of the disgraceful articles of the Treaty of Versailles for Germany. At the parade held on the Day of Remembrance of the Heroes in the presence of Field Marshal Mackensen, participated representatives of all branches of the army, including several battalions of the newly created armoured forces, however, mostly without material. In preparation at first wanted to exclude armoured troops from participation in the parade, because, in the words of one officer of the General Staff with their short carbines, they will not be able to execute the command on guard. Despite these weighty arguments, I still managed to get the armoured units to participate in the parade. On March 16, 1936, I was invited to an evening talk with the British military attaché. Shortly before I left home, the radio broadcast a government announcement about the reintroduction of universal conscription in Germany. The conversation I had that evening with the English attaché and a Swedish officer of my acquaintance who was present was extremely lively. Both these officers expressed full understanding when I said that the German army had met with satisfaction the glad tidings of the introduction of universal conscription. Theoretically, we have set ourselves the goal of equalizing in the field of armed forces with our well-armed neighbours. In practice, however, especially with regard to armoured forces, we could not even think of having in the near future an armament that was at least approximately equal in quantity and quality to that of our neighbours. Therefore, first of all, we tried to equal them in terms of the organizational structure of armoured forces and their management. The consolidation of our few armoured forces into large formations, divisions, and the consolidation of these divisions into a corps was to compensate for the shortfall in quantity. First of all, our military chiefs had to make sure that the path we had chosen was the right one, and that the plan was feasible. For this purpose, the Motorized Mechanized Forces Command, established in June 1934, decided to conduct under the leadership of General Lutz in the summer of 1935, a 4-week training exercise for a tank division, which was combined with all armoured units available at that time. General Weeches was appointed commander of this training division. The units and subunits of the division were assembled at the Munster training camp, where systematic training was carried out with them. The main task during this period was not to teach commanders to make their own decisions and execute them, but to prove in general the possibility of tank formations moving and fighting in interaction with other branches of the army. Generals Blomberg and Freisch followed these exercises with great interest. General Lutz invited Hitler to attend the exercise, but the passive resistance of Hitler's adjutant prevented him from doing so. The results of the exercise were quite satisfactory. When the yellow balloon was released as a signal of the end of the exercise, Colonel General Fritsch jokingly say, "Now it remains to be on the balloon," appeared on the inscription, "Guderian's tanks the best." At the head of the newly created management of armoured forces was placed General Lutz. The creation of a tank corps headquarters with normal staffs met with resistance from the Chief of the General Staff of the Army, General Beck. By October 15, 1935, 3 armoured divisions had been formed. The 1st Armoured Division under General Weech, located in Weimar. The 2nd Armoured Division under Colonel Guderian, located in Wurzburg. And the 3rd Armoured Division under General Fessmann, located in Berlin. Early in October, I left Berlin to change my service in the central apparatus to practical work with the troops. I knew that after the appointment of General Lutz, the command of armoured forces was in good hands, however had to reckon with the ever-increasing opposition from many members of the General Staff, and I doubted whether the officer who replaced me as Chief of Staff of Armoured Forces will be able to resist their influence. It was also doubtful whether the Armoured Forces Inspectorate, which had the task of protecting the interests of armoured forces in the Directorate of General Affairs of the Army, would be able to carry out further development of armoured forces in the direction in which we had previously conceived. Both in the command of the armoured forces and in the inspection, what I had feared happened. The command made concessions, satisfying the wish of the Chief of the General Staff to create tank brigades intended only for interaction with the infantry. For this purpose, already in 1936, the 4th Tank Brigade was created in Stuttgart. The wishes of the Cavalry Command to strengthen the role of motorized units were also satisfied, and instead of new tank divisions, 3 so-called light divisions were formed, each having 2 motorized infantry regiments, a reconnaissance regiment and an artillery regiment, a tank battalion and a number of other units and subdivisions. In order to increase the speed of movement of the tank battalion on highways, it was proposed to load tanks on trucks with special trailers. This proposal was completely useless, because only the then available T1 and TTI types of tanks could be mounted on trailers, but not the TSA and TNFD TUF types of tanks, which were to enter service in 1938. In addition to the light divisions, 4 motorized divisions were also formed, which were conventional fully motorized infantry divisions. A large number of motorized vehicles were required for their motorization. Thus, the 14th Army Corps, consisting of motorized divisions, and the 15th Army Corps, consisting of light divisions, were formed. 3 armoured divisions, subordinate to the Armoured Forces Directorate, became part of the 16th Army Corps. All 3 corps were consolidated into one newly created 4th group under the command of General Bruchich, with headquarters in Leipzig. The group headquarters was responsible for training and manning of these formations. The old uniform for all armoured forces pink colour of the fringes was cancelled. Only tank regiments and anti-tank divisions had pink trim. Reconnaissance battalions of armoured divisions had first yellow and then brown trim. Infantry regiments and motorcycle units of the tank division had green trim, cavalry regiments of light divisions, yellow, and motorized infantry regiments still white. Naturally, with this situation in the affairs of armoured forces interfered with the inspection of infantry and cavalry. I was extremely saddened by this fragmentation of armoured and motorized units, but I could do nothing against the fact that the development of armoured forces took this path. Only later did they begin, and then only partially, to develop along the right path. Our already limited auxiliary means necessary for solving the tasks in the field of motorization were wasted because of organizational mistakes made by other branches of the armed forces. For example, General from Chief of Army General Affairs ordered the motorization of the 14th anti-tank companies of the infantry regiments. To my objection that it would be more expedient to transfer these companies, which are part of the regiments moving on foot, on horse traction. From reply, the infantry also need to have a few vehicles. My proposal to convert heavy artillery divisions to Metjäger instead of anti-tank companies was rejected. These heavy guns remained horse-drawn, and during the war, especially in Russia, they could not cope with their tasks. The production of tracked vehicles needed for the auxiliary units, forming part of the armoured divisions, was all the time carried out at a pace that could not in any way satisfy us. It was clear that the effectiveness of the division depended to a large extent on how the motorized infantry units artillery, as well as other parts and units of the division would move. Semi-tracked lightly armoured vehicles were needed for the transportation of motorized infantry, engineer and sanitation units, self-propelled units for artillery and anti-tank divisions, and tanks of various designs for reconnaissance and communications battalions. The provision of tank divisions with all these types of equipment was never fully realized. In spite of ever-increasing production capacity, our industry was unable to meet the enormous demand of the newly created motorized formations of the Wehrmacht and SA troops, as well as the demand of the national economy, which also needed vehicles. Despite all the warnings of the experts, the High Command did not want to reckon with any restrictions, and Hitler's ego contributed even more to the High Command maintaining this position. In describing the military events of 1941, we will return to this issue. Being with my Panzer Division in Wurzburg, I was only able to deal with all the above-mentioned issues in between. My main focus was on the combat training and manning of the divisions formed in various parts of the country. The winter of 1935-36 passed quietly. In Wurzburg, I was well received both by the officers of the garrison, whose chief was then General Branty, and by the local authorities. I settled on Belkstrasse in a small house with a splendid view of the town, situated in the valley of the Main. In the spring of 1936, we were astonished by Hitler's decision to occupy the Rhineland. Armoured troops were not used in this, as the occupation of the Rhine represented militarily nothing more than a gesture. It is true that my division was raised on alert and moved to the training ground at Munzingen, but without the tank brigade, which remained in place to avoid unwanted complications. A few weeks later, the entire division returned back to its permanent cantonment. On August 1 of the same year, I was promoted to the rank of Major General. In the manoeuvres held in the fall of 1936, only the 4th Tank Regiment located in Schweinfurt took part. A single tank regiment participating in manoeuvres as part of an infantry division could not, of course, give a clear picture of the combat capabilities of armoured forces. Among the guests at these manoeuvres was Colonel General von Seeckt, who had returned from East Asia. I had the honour of giving him some information about armoured troops which he had not had to encounter before. I then had to address the invited members of the press and acquaint them with the organisation and combat use of the new branch of the army. The year 1937 passed quietly. We were diligently engaged in combat training, culminating in division-wide manoeuvres at Grafenwetter training camp. On behalf of General Lutz, I wrote a book in the winter of 1936 entitled Attention Tanks. In it I outlined the history of the origin and development of tanks, as well as my views on the basic principles of the organization of the German armored forces in the future. With this book I wanted to explain our views to a wider circle of people, which could not be done by following only a dry service path. In addition, I tried, by publicizing our views on the pages of the military press, to refute in my articles the arguments of opponents in which I had no shortage. Our views were summarized in my article, published on October 15, 1937, in the Military Journal, which was the official organ of the Imperial German Officers' Union. In view of the fact that the content of this article gives a complete picture of the struggle of opinions that was going on at that time, I give below its full text. When it comes to talking about a tank attack, not specialists usually imagine the steel monsters that appeared at Cambrai and Amiens, as they had to read about in correspondence from the theatre of war. They imagine wire fences, broken through as if they were made of straw, dugouts and machine guns crushed and mixed with the ground, tanks, ironing the trenches, the noise of their engines, flames bursting out of the exhaust pipes. All this gave rise to the so-called tankophobia, which many considered the cause of our defeat on August 8, 1918. Thus, one of the properties of tanks, and by no means the most important one, namely their ironing action, is considered by many critics as the most important combat property. Based on this view, they imagine a tank attack as an attack of a large number of tanks moving in close formation as large targets for anti-tank weapons and artillery, having almost the same direction of movement and the same speed. It seems to them that all tanks are rushing towards the defender in order to crush the enemy on the order of their commander, even when moving through difficult terrain. Fire capabilities of the tank were assessed extremely low. They found that the tank is blind and deaf, denied the possibility of holding tank troops seized terrain. Representatives of the opposite point of view believed that tanks could no longer suddenly attack the defender, that anti-tank means and artillery of the defender were able to fight tanks under any circumstances, that the defender was always exactly where the tanks were advancing, that optical devices allowed the defender to conduct observation even in fog and twilight, and so on. Based on this view, our critics concluded that the tank offensive had no prospect. They decided that the armoured forces should be abolished. As one of the critics stated, the era of tanks should simply be jumped over. By doing so, they would in one fell swoop save themselves the trouble of thinking about changing the tactics of the old branches of the military, so that they could quietly return to the tactics of positional warfare used in 1914-1915. But it's bad to jump in the dark when you don't know where you're going to fall, until our critics point out to us another and better way to achieve offensive success than their proposed disbandment of armoured forces. We will fight for our principles based on the fact that it is tanks, when properly used, which are at present the best offensive means in ground operations. In order to paint a clearer picture of the prospects for the tank offensive, let us consider the most salient features of tanks. Armour. Tanks of any type designed for combat operations have protection primarily against armour-piercing bullets. However, this protection is insufficient to fight the enemy's anti-tank guns and tanks. Therefore, the tanks of the so-called victorious countries in the World War, and above all French tanks, designed for this purpose, have more reliable protection. For example, to penetrate the armour of a French 2C tank, a 75 MA caliber gun is. If an army uses for the offensive in the first echelon of tanks that have reliable armour, which protects them from the bulk of the enemy's anti-tank artillery, then the success of its actions against this most dangerous anti-tank weapons will be guaranteed. Thus, sooner or later the success of actions conducted against the enemy's infantry and sapper units will also be assured. This success can be achieved under the cover of heavy tanks, and after the enemy's anti-tank weapons have been disabled, also under the cover of lighter types of tanks. On the contrary, if the defender will be provided with anti-tank artillery, capable of penetrating the armour of any tank of the advancing enemy, and will be able to enter into battle this anti-tank artillery in a timely manner, and at a decisive point, the success of tank units will be achieved at the cost of great sacrifice, and with sufficient density and depth of anti-tank defence success of tanks in general will be in doubt. The struggle between armour and shell, which has been going on since ancient times, continues to be of importance for armoured forces at the present time. It will continue in the future, as it is in the engineering forces building long-term fortifications, in the Navy, and recently in aviation. The uncertainty of the outcome of this fight is by no means a reason to throw tanks into battle without sufficient armour, because in this case the only protection of the advancing will again be his cloth uniform, which, as the World War showed, is far from perfect. Mobility. It is said that mobility alone is the guarantee of victory. If we agree with this interpretation and wish to use all the auxiliary technical means now available for its realization. In order to get close to the enemy, troops must move. For this purpose they march on foot, on horseback, by rail, and more recently by automobiles and airplanes. When troops come in contact with the enemy, movement ceases for the most part under his fire. In order to resume movement, it is necessary either to destroy the enemy, or at least to suppress his resistance, or to force him to abandon his positions. This may be accomplished by the use of one's own firepower, which is superior to that of the enemy to such an extent that it can silence his artillery and machine guns. Firing from positions prepared in advance may be conducted to the sighting distance of the main firepower. Up to this limit, the infantry can move under cover of the main firepower. Then the heavy weapons and artillery must change firing positions to be able to cover the infantry movement again. Fighting in this manner requires a large amount of firepower and even more ammunition. In this mode of action, the concentration of forces to go on the offensive requires a lot of time and can hardly be concealed. The element of surprise, an essential factor in the struggle to achieve victory, is called into question. But even when the offensive manages to achieve surprise, he, having started moving, immediately reveals his cards to the enemy, and the defender immediately directs his reserves to the object of attack to organize the defense here. It must be said at the same time that the creation of new defensive lines, since the reserves were motorized, has become a matter much easier than it was before. Therefore, the speed of infantry and artillery movement during the offensive is not as important to success as it was during the last war. Thus, the first thing to do is to ensure that the troops move at a faster pace than before and be able, despite the fire of the defending enemy, to continue to move. thus preventing the creation of new defensive lines and strike deep into his defences. Proponents of armoured forces are confident that under favourable conditions, a means can be found to achieve the above goal. Our opponents believe that the element of surprise used in 1918, today in the tank offensive, can no longer lead to the desired results. It turns out that the tank offensive is no longer able to take the enemy by surprise. How, then, is it possible to achieve surprise in war, regardless of whether new or old means will be used? It is known that as early as 1916, General of Infantry von Kuhl proposed to the High Command of the German Army to carry out a breakthrough of the front, applying surprise as the main element, although he did not have any new offensive means at his disposal. The offensive in the Michael area in 1918 was a great success solely due to the proper use of the element of surprise, and no new offensive means were used. If, however, to all the other means of achieving surprise, new combat means are added, the success of the operation will be more assured. However, the presence of such means is not a prerequisite for achieving surprise. We are confident that by using tanks in the offensive, we will be able to move much faster than we have moved so far, and that after a successful breakthrough we will continue to advance further. This fact is perhaps the most important. We are confident that the advance of the tanks will be successful if certain conditions are created beforehand on which the success of the tank offensive now depends. Concentration of forces on an advantageous piece of terrain, the presence of weaknesses in the enemy's defences, superiority over him in tanks, etc. When it is pointed out to us that we will not be able to succeed in all offensive operations, and that with our tanks armed with machine guns, we will be unable to storm fortresses, we are forced to refer to the fact that all other weapons, unfortunately, in many respects do not yet meet the objectives of the offensive, and we can add that we are not all-powerful. It is said that any kind of weapon can be used most effectively only when it is new, and when the proper means of defence against it have not yet been established. Poor artillery. It has already existed for centuries. Poor aviation. It, too, is beginning to grow old, since the means of air defence have already been established against it as well. We have no doubt that the effectiveness of any weapon depends on the state of the corresponding means of defence against it. If tanks are confronted with superior forces of the enemy, with his tanks or anti-tank artillery, they are inevitably defeated. However, the effectiveness of the weapon, regardless of the state of the countermeasures, depends also on the desire to quickly use all the innovations, staying on the technical level of the era. In this respect, no other type of weapon does not have such favourable opportunities as tanks. The artillery shells of the Defender have nowadays a much greater velocity than the shells of the artillery mounted on tanks, and no one has ever doubted this until now. Nevertheless, already in 1917-1918 hundreds of tanks were located directly behind the front line. Hundreds of tanks managed to safely slip through the enemy's barrage, and dozens of infantry and even cavalry divisions rushed after the tanks. In this case, the offensive was carried out without prior artillery preparation, and the offensive captured completely intact enemy artillery. The artillery of the Defender can seriously delay the advance of tanks only under particularly unfavourable circumstances. However, as soon as the tanks manage to break through and reach the firing positions of the enemy artillery batteries are immediately silenced and cease to be dangerous also for the infantry. The traditional tactic of artillery. Conducting barrage fire along the threatened area in conditions of reduced visibility just did not justify itself in the last war. Of course, the dust raised by enemy shells limits visibility from tanks, but this obstacle is not insurmountable. We are studying ways to overcome this kind of obstacle. Tanks have already gained the ability to move even at night and in fog, using a compass. When conducting an offensive involving tanks, decisive role belongs to the latter, not infantry, because the failure of tanks entails the failure of the entire offensive and, conversely, the success of the tanks provides victory. Fire, armour and mobility are not all the combat properties of the tank. Its most important property is fire. A tank can fire either from a position or from a move. In both cases, the tank fires at direct fire. When a tank fires from a position at a detected target, it can achieve great effectiveness. By direct fire and using good optics, the tank can easily destroy a target located a distance from the actual fire in a short time and without much ammunition being expended. When the tank is moving, the limited field of view would seem to make it difficult for the gunner to observe the enemy. But since the gun in the tank is located at a considerable height, it makes it easier to find targets even on terrain covered with vegetation. Thus, the tank's greater height, which increases its vulnerability by making it an excellent target for anti-tank weapons, is to some extent useful to the gunner. When firing from the move, the possibility of hitting the target is quite real at close range. It becomes much less as the distance from the target increases, as the speed of the tank increases, and as the tank moves over rough terrain. At any rate, at present only tanks alone have the ability to engage in ground combat, advancing on the defending enemy and firing on him even before his machine guns and artillery are suppressed. We have no doubt that when firing from a position, the probability of a hit is greater than when firing from a move. This we ourselves know very well and allow both kinds of fire. However, advancement alone is the key to victory. Should tanks be used in the offensive only for the purpose of breaking through the main strip of deeply echeloned enemy defences, saturated with anti-tank weapons and artillery, i.e. is the tank offensive a battle of technology, as it was during the World War? Certainly not. Who thinks so, he proceeds from the idea of only infantry tanks, i.e. such tank units, whose task is exhausted by close interaction with the infantry, and which operate at the same pace as the infantry, while its advance we consider too slow. We can afford neither preliminary reconnaissances, carried on for weeks and months, nor great expenditure of ammunition. We do not wish to do this. Instead, we aim to paralyze the enemy at a predetermined time, at the same time to the full depth of his defences. We are well aware of the fact that with their limited ammunition, supply tanks are not able to conduct a systematic artillery preparation or a massive artillery strike. Tanks should conduct targeted direct fire and single shots, because long military experience has shown that even hurricane artillery fire, lasting for weeks, was not able to help the infantry to win. Given the combat experience of our opponents, we believe that it is the tanks are able to make rapid strikes simultaneously on different parts of the enemy's defences on a significant width of the front, that it is they play a decisive role in achieving the overall success of the offensive, and that the success achieved by them will have more than just a tactical significance, which were the breakthroughs of tanks during the First World War. Targeted fire of tanks will not only slightly hit the enemy, as it happens when firing on areas requiring a colossal and useless consumption of ammunition. Tanks with sufficient density, width of the offensive front and depth of combat orders can destroy a significant part of the detected enemy targets and make a gap in his defence, where our reserves will rush at a speed much greater than it was in 1918. We consider it necessary that these reserves should consist of armoured divisions, since all other branches of the army lack the combat capability, speed, and mobility necessary for the success of the offensive and the subsequent pursuit of the enemy. Thus, we cannot agree with the view that tanks are only an additional means to achieve decisive success in battle and that, interacting with other branches of the army, they only in some favourable conditions should support the advance of the infantry. If the tanks will be given only a supporting role, everything will remain as it was in 1916. If we do not make a decisive leap, we will be forced to go back to position warfare, burying any hope of a quick, decisive success in the future. Neither the assumption of large stores of ammunition in the hands of our future opponents, nor the increasing accuracy and range of artillery of existing calibers, nor the great improvement in firing techniques can shake our views. On the contrary, we believe that in the offensive the tanks are the main branch of the army, and this view we shall firmly maintain until technology provides us with something better. We can by no means tolerate an artillery preparation which requires too much time and the abandonment of the element of surprise, guided only by the principle that supposedly fire alone secures the beginning of a movement. On the contrary, we believe that armoured motors can carry our weapons to the enemy's location without such preliminary artillery preparation, if only the following essential conditions are met. Movement on convenient terrain, surprise, massive use of tanks. The words massive use lead to a shudder of our critics. They write, the question arises whether in principle is correct in the massive use of tanks, and whether it would not be more appropriate to use them in conjunction with the infantry to give the offensive the necessary scope. In this statement we first of all find the recognition of our critics that the infantry offensive without tanks cannot achieve the necessary scope. Hence we conclude that the branch of the army, whose actions can give the offensive the necessary scope, should certainly be considered the main branch of the army. The question of whether tanks should be distributed among infantry units or not can be clarified by the following example. There is a war going on between the Reds and the Blues. Each of the belligerents has 100 infantry divisions and 100 tank battalions. The Reds have distributed tanks to the infantry divisions. The Blues have organized them into tank divisions, which make up the reserve of the main command. The front line length of, say, 300 km is characterized as follows. 100 km of the front line is tank-accessible terrain, 100 kmi, terrain with separate obstacles and obstacles for tanks, and the remaining 100 kma tank-accessible terrain. Therefore, when the Blues go on the offensive, it is quite possible that there will be such a situation. A significant part of the Red infantry divisions with tanks will be located against the positions of the Blues on the tank-accessible terrain, where tanks cannot be used at all, and another part of their divisions with tanks will be located in front of the terrain that is not favourable for the action of tanks. Therefore, the tanks of the latter, being in slightly better conditions than the tanks of the first part of the divisions, also unlikely to be able to count on success. In any case, the Reds will be able to use only part of their tanks, located in front of the tank-accessible terrain. Blue, on the contrary, will be able to concentrate all their tanks on the decisive direction, where the terrain is most favourable to their actions. They will be able to enter the battle with at least double superiority in tanks, and on the rest of the front can organise defence against the dispersed tank units of the Red infantry division, which has at its disposal about 50 anti-tank guns. It is much easier to defend against 50 than against 200 advancing tanks. Therefore, in the proposal to distribute tanks to infantry divisions, we see no more than a return to the primitive tactics of the British, which they adhered to in 1916, 1917. This tactic even then showed its complete failure, so it was then replaced by the tactic of concentrating forces and means in one direction, which led to success during the Battle of Cambrai. We wish to achieve victory by means of a type of weapon that can be quickly moved to the area of the enemy's location, firing direct fire, protected by armour and moving with the help of a motor. It has been said that the motor is not a new weapon, but only a new way of moving the old type of warfare. It is well known that motors themselves do not fire. When we speak of armoured forces as something new, we mean a new kind of troops, just as, for example, the use of the motor by the Navy led to the emergence of submarines. Only through the use of the motor was possible the emergence of the airplane, and with it, the Air Force. Consequently, here too we are talking about a new kind of troops. We, tankers, consider our kind of troops quite mature and are confident that our success in future battles will put an imprint on the upcoming events. If the offensive of tanks will be successful, then all other branches of troops will have to adapt to operate at the same pace with them. That is why we demand that those branches of the troops which will interact with us to develop our success should also be mobile and be assigned to us while still in peacetime, because it is not the number of infantry, but the number of armoured troops which will be decisive in future battles. In the late fall of 1937, there were major manoeuvres, which were attended by Hitler, and in the last days of the manoeuvres, and foreign guests. Mussolini, British Field Marshal Sir Cyril Deverell, Italian Marshal Badoglio, and the Hungarian military mission from the armoured forces to participate in the manoeuvres were involved in the 3rd Armoured Division under the command of General Fessman and the 1st Armoured Brigade. I was entrusted with the leadership of the intermediary headquarters of armoured forces. The results of manoeuvres showed that the Armoured Division is quite justified as a combat unit. Only its supply and repair services worked unsatisfactorily. It was necessary to take appropriate measures to improve the work of these services. I presented my considerations on this issue to the Corps Command. Unfortunately, my suggestions were not taken into account, and the same shortcomings made themselves felt again in the spring of 1938. On the last day of the manoeuvres, a major offensive of all tank forces participating in the manoeuvres under my command was held especially for the foreign guests. The impression was exceptionally strong, although we had only small TI tanks at that time. After the manoeuvres in Berlin, there was a parade of troops, and then the final breakfast, arranged by Colonel General Baron von Fritsch for foreign guests. This occasion gave me opportunity to take part in a number of interesting conversations, including Field Marshal Sir Cyril Deverell and Marshal Badoglio. Badoglio spoke of his experience in the Abyssinian campaign, so Deverell was interested in my views on the problems of motorization. The young British officers wondered whether it was possible to move such a large number of tanks on the battlefield during real combat operations, as we did in manoeuvres arranged for Mussolini. They did not believe in such a possibility, and many of them were supporters of the theory of using armoured forces only as an auxiliary branch of the army. In any case, the conversations were extremely lively.